Okay.
So, hi. Uh, do you use yeah, start again. Do you use a criminal background check to qualify your tenants? You might not be able to soon in Connecticut. But first, this is Ed Weinberg. I'm an associate broker at Keller Williams in Trumbull, Connecticut. I'm also an investor, and I've done flips and had long-term investments for decades. You can find this and other interviews on Facebook.com at CTRE Media, my business page, and on my Facebook group, CTRE Investors. Please join on our YouTube channel, also called CTRE Investors, and at CTREinvestors.com. Today, I'm joined by John Souza. He's the only landlord on the CT Assembly Reentry Working Group Committee, and attorney Michael Clinton. So let me bring the other guys on. And why don't you introduce yourself, John?
Hey, good evening, Ed. John Souza, and I am a full-time landlord, like you said, and I volunteer as president of Connecticut Coalition of Property Owners. We're your voice at the state capitol, and we try to get involved in as many issues as possible that would affect small and mid-sized landlords and try to be a constructive force for the better for us.
Okay. And Michael, why don't you tell us about your law practice?
Yes. Hi, Ed. Thanks for having me on tonight. And hi, John. My law practice focuses on landlords, and I represent landlords throughout the state of Connecticut. I'm on the board of directors of the CCOPO with John, and I'm active in other groups. And one of the things that I try to do is work with John and our legislative teams to watch and observe the legislature as they pass laws or consider passing laws that may affect landlords.
Okay. And Michael, why don't we start by you telling us what's the issue, what did HUD do, and what is it that Connecticut is thinking of doing?
Well, what we're talking about tonight is the impact of HUD's regulations, or it's actually guidance that they've prepared, and it's a few years old now, actually. But what they've prepared is a criminal background screening process, which prevents the disparate impact of using criminal histories to impair the ability of prospective tenants to obtain housing based on a criminal history that might be stale or not really material to whether they would be a good tenant. And they provided this guidance in the spring of 2016, and it's been filtering for the last couple of years. And now the commission that the working group John is with the legislature, is considering how to implement the guidelines, the HUD guidance in Connecticut, by creating scenarios which landlords must comply with when they're screening tenants.
Okay. And so, John, tell me about the Connecticut Coalition of Property Owners and and your seat at the table of this working group.
Sure, Ed. First of all, let me tell you, this group was created by statute last year to study this problem of people coming out of incarceration. They have a very high rate of homelessness. And what happens is they go from when they come out of prison, if they don't have support, if they don't have any kind of structure, and it all really starts with having a home. If they don't have that, they end up back in prison or back in the ERs or back on the street many times over. And it's much more expensive for towns and cities to deal with the problem that way than with dealing with supportive housing to give these people a leg up to get going again. So they created this group to come up with suggested statutes so that they could propose it this year at the state legislature. Our group, like we have been for the last 20 years, tries to get involved with anything that's going to affect landlords and property owners. And we're pretty good at it. And we're actually known as a voice of reason up there. And people actually do like to hear our input, which I do appreciate. They don't always take our advice, but at least we can deflect the worst of things, and we try and get the best we can for landlords when all these subjects come up. Just to give you an idea. So some of the groups that are involved with this committee, just so you have an idea: the Department of Housing, the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness, Yale School of Public Health, Justice, Housing, and Health Study, Yale Law School Reentry Clinic, One Standard of Justice, Community Partners in Action, CRT, Partners for a Strong Community, Department of Corrections, City of Hartford, the American Civil Liberties Union.
Okay, so there's about 40 people in this group. Is that right?
There's a large group. Up until the third meeting when I was there, and there was one other property manager in that same meeting, which I don't consider them landlords. A lot of times they have a little bit different interests than landlords because they don't have their hands dirty and they don't have the skin in the game a lot of the times. Yes, they want the same things we want a lot of the times, but sometimes they don't. So I was happy to be there and try and put some input for landlords.
Okay. If you're watching live and want to comment, make sure you're watching from the bit.ly URL that's in the announcement, and we'll answer all questions, and maybe you can give me a like. So, we know you're there, even if you're not making a comment. And if you're watching us on the replay, please hit the like so we know that you're there, and we know you like us. Okay. So what were some of the examples of things that you thought would be good for them to have in the law, John?
Well, let's put it like this. There was a lot of things there that would be beneficial to people coming out of the institutions in this case that didn't affect us, which I think everybody can support. That includes supportive housing, which is intensive. So the people coming out, they would get a group of people anywhere. If they need mental health services, if they need addiction services, they would get this stuff. They would get help getting housing. They would get help with security deposits, all kinds of stuff like that proposed, which, overall makes a lot of sense, right? It's so expensive to put people in prison and keep them there. And it doesn't cost that much to get them going again with these services, help them get a job. It's some of the simplest things that you think would be a no-brainer. One of the people was talking about having telephone lines at shelters that don't answer the phone saying, hello, this is the shelter. They just say, hello, can I take a message? So they don't know what it is. And a potential employer or a landlord could leave a message at that number, but that doesn't exist because I guess of money or whatever. And something simple as that can make a big difference in their lives.
So what are you suggesting that they do for landlords as far as I guess let's go back to Michael. Michael, can you tell us, do you have anything specific about what the HUD guidelines said that I guess the state is using to clarify what it is that we're supposed to be doing?
Sure. One of the things that the HUD guidelines, when you read the guidance, one of the things that surprised me was that since 2004, 650,000 inmates are coming out of prisons every year. They need to be housed. There's an issue with that. And if you look at the prison population, there is a disparate number or disproportionate number of minorities in our prison system, so that the HUD guidelines are concerned that utilizing criminal records as a pure benchmark with no underlying fact basis has a discriminatory effect on minorities. And that's essentially the whole purpose of the guidance. And what HUD has taken from that is that they've created a 3-step process. And the first is, does the policy that the landlord has in its intake process have a discriminatory effect? And even if it's innocuous in its nature, but it has the effect because it disproportionately impacts minorities, that will be the first step. Once the complainant, or if the tenant has established this for HUD's purposes of dealing with conflict, the burden shifts to the landlord to show that they have a substantial that they have a substantial legitimate basis for their policy, and which 99% of the landlords, when you look at the case law and the studies that are out there, and there's not a lot yet because it's only 2 years old, so they haven't filtered through the courts yet, but 99% of the discussion has been, it's to protect my other tenants. And that blanket statement needs to be supported with some empirical evidence and some legit logical conclusions. And if the landlord can show that, then the third step goes back to the tenant or the complainant, the applicant, who would say, yes, but your policy could be less, less obtrusive and less black and white by utilizing techniques like look at the underlying claim involved. So if you have a case, let's just use a basic landlord that says, I will not take any felons with no time frames. Well, HUD clearly thinks that's improper because somebody that has a felony conviction from 25 years ago and has a good exemplary citizenship history since then shouldn't be excluded based on that checkbox, if you will. And one of the other things that I found surprising was that in the HUD guidelines, they calculate that as many as 100 million Americans have some sort of criminal record. And that shocked me too, because you're talking somewhere in the neighborhood of almost a third of our population. So the point there was, now they need to take a look at what's the underlying conviction about, so that there's a difference between an armed robbery and maybe a felony drunk driving case, and what the risk to your community may be, how long ago it occurred, are there any mitigating factors and things like that. Once the landlord does that step 3 and can show that step 3, now they've begun to mitigate the disparate impact.
Okay. And if you're watching, if you can, we see people there, but if you just give us a like, we'll know who you are. And if you have any questions, if you're watching from the bit.ly link that's in the share that you probably saw, then you can comment and we'll answer it. If you're not there, we won't see it and you'll think we're ignoring you. All right. So, John, you have some examples on what you think would be a reasonable and what you think would be an unreasonable reason to not allow somebody who is to rent from you?
Well, before we get there, can I add something to what Mike is saying? Mike is saying basically what we do now is that HUD is basically requiring or asking that we treat every person as an individual and look at their situation and weigh subjectively their crimes in the past and how much it would affect the building. And the problem I have with that is once you start doing that, you're kind of opening yourself up for lawsuits. And that's the problem. If I weigh certain crimes one way and I do it wrong and somebody disagrees, the only way to solve it is I get sued by, somebody through the CHROOH system, and it can be very expensive for small landlords. It's not an easy system, to deal with, especially for the small guys. They can cost thousands and thousands of dollars, and it's a burden, quite frankly, to landlords.
Okay, can one of you guys tell me? I guess Michael, what's CHROOH?
Oh, Commission on Human Rights Organization, and that's Connecticut's commission to enforce the discrimination statutes for purposes of Connecticut statutes, but they also most claims can be referred to the HUD office or to the office in Boston for if it's employment discrimination, EEOC. So one of the things I was going to just kind of piggyback on John was one of the concerns is that if we're using a subjective basis, it becomes difficult for landlords, and we're talking about trying to make sure there's a presumption that the landlords are acting in good faith, as opposed to in the 3-step process that if it's simply a disparate impact, the burden all shifts to the landlord to prove they're acting in good faith. And it doesn't change, and HUD still has in the guidelines that if you are directly discriminating it doesn't really matter what technique you're using. And the example for that is simply if you take a minority convicted felon and a non-minority convicted felon, and you let in the non-minority and not the minority, then we know right off the bat that you have committed discrimination, de facto discrimination, because there'd be no other reasonable explanation for that difference. That's not the disparate impact where you've treated everybody the same, but the impact on them is disproportionate to a minority. I hope that makes sense. But the point of that is, I think the Connecticut, as we look at this issue, can mitigate the subjective nature in which landlords will get claims. And that's the goal, I think, for us, is to protect small landlords, because they don't really know that well, the nuances of discrimination statutes. They kind of know, hey, you can't discriminate based on race, religion, creed, etc. But they don't really know the nuances of, well, that's a disparate impact on that race, religion, creed. So that's one of the things we're trying to minimize as legislation gets proposed in the future.
Okay. John, you have anything to add?
Oh, that was Mike is hitting the nail on the head there. So we're trying to stay on top of stuff like that. If we could change some of the definitions that, for proof of the discrimination, that would be a big help to landlords. It's a little technical, but Mike could explain it if he wants. We can go into it in a minute. That's the kind of thing that, makes a big difference in landlords' lives. These little things, instead of, getting sued to oblivion, if they could go and simply, make them take a course so they would understand it. Little landlords, they have no idea what's coming at them sometimes. And if they could simply, have a slap on the wrist, learn what they need to learn, and go back to being a landlord, I think everyone would be better off, instead of, coming out with lawsuits to try and solve problems.
So should they be changing? I guess we're talking about, Michael, we're talking about where the bar should be. Should they be changing the bar in Connecticut that they use to determine that landlords are discriminating with respect to fair housing with race and other protected classes?
Well, we've discussed how that could be implemented in order to be fair towards landlords that are trying to act in good faith. And what we've proposed is that if the allegation is that you've created a disparate impact discrimination situation, that the discrimination and the look at your legitimate purpose be proven with a higher standard than a preponderance of evidence, and actually with clear and convincing evidence, something less than your criminal standard, which is beyond reasonable doubt. So what we're hoping is to ratchet up the requirements to prove the discrimination, so that the innocent landlord that is not savvy enough to understand the nuances of the subjective nature might survive claims against them. And as John said, the goal here is education and not litigation. And the goal here is housing. John is in the business of housing people, not in denying housing. John's in the business of creating homes for people. So when they're landlords are doing that, the goal here is to give them some tools to do so, and to help the populations that need the help, but not in a situation where an innocent mistake costs thousands of dollars in legal fees and penalties. So we're hoping to have balance in this, so that we can help these populations that need the opportunity for housing and jobs and things that come with it.
Okay, John, you have anything to add?
No, Michael hit it on the head for that in that case.
All right, then, you know what? I think we're going to just wrap this up. Again, I'm Ed Weinberg. We were talking about a criminal background check to qualify your tenants, and how Connecticut may soon have a law that makes that more difficult to do. So you can find this and Facebook at CTRE Media, on my Facebook group CTRE Investors, our YouTube channel CTRE Investors, and at ctreinvestors.com. And I'd really like to thank you for sticking around and watching. And I'd like to thank John Souza and attorney Michael H. Clinton for joining me today. So goodbye, everybody, and have a fantastic day.
Thanks.